So today we are very pleased to have our annual meeting of the Economic Outlook for 2024. And to introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce Dennis Lockhart, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the former president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve. And I'd also say that as we hear the program, we're going to give plenty of time for members to be able to ask questions. We'll have 2 microphones, and we'll go back and forth. So thank you for thinking of your good questions now. Dennis?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure by now, after several years of Raphael speaking, you're familiar with his bio, but I'll quickly go over it. A native of New Jersey, educated at Harvard University, and then got his PhD in economics at Stanford University. Went to work for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System right out of his PhD program. Later served as Assistant Secretary in HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Agency. His academic career was mostly at University of Southern California, where he was a department chair in the Price School of Public Policy. And in 2017, he became the 15th president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And in that capacity, he serves on the Federal Open Market Committee. I learned something over the holidays. In his spare time, Raphael collects colorful, some might even say exotic socks. So Raphael, come on up. I hope you have your socks on today. Well, in years past, Raphael, you will remember that I'm flattered by the way that you asked me to interview you these last few years. I have brought a gift, and a couple of years ago, I gave Raphael a cigar, a Paul Volcker cigar. Volcker had the habit, when presented with a tough question, of pulling out a cigar and unwrapping it and taking his time while he was thinking of what his answer was going to be. And last year, I believe I gave you a Zimbabwe $10 billion note to just remember.
Yeah, I still have that.
I'm sure you do. So just remember the responsibility for inflation. So this year, this is a toilet seat cushion. Some of the audience probably have already invested in an item like this. And it tees up my first question, and that is, in the coming year, are you expecting a soft landing?
And you wonder why we ask you to do this, right?
I'm already working on next year.
But first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year. It's good to be here. It's always fun to come and talk to my Rotary about what I do professionally. To your question about the soft landing, and I'm glad you didn't ask me to sit on that. That would have been a different kind of program. I was reflecting on last year when we were here, and how the whole message that I wanted people to leave with was that inflation was too high. It was not sustainable. It was not good for our economy. We were going to do all we needed to do to get it back down to target. And so you fast forward, and it was at all costs, right? It was, this is the most important thing, 100%. Now you fast forward a year, inflation has come down quite a bit. And in fact, more than I expected. So I was looking, so we have to do public projections of what we expect to happen. And when I looked at where I thought inflation would be in June, it was 0.5 percentage point higher than it is right now. That was 6 months ago. So it's come down a lot, and we've had to adapt in many regards. But we're still not at 2%. right? So it's still a little, around 3% right now, which means there's still some space to go. The other thing that's been remarkable is a year ago, when I was talking about getting inflation down, the next question everybody asks is, well, doesn't that mean we're going to have a recession? Doesn't that mean that everything is going to collapse and that you're going to see the economic energy of this economy really constrict down to zero or even less? And the remarkable thing, that has not happened. I actually have had to adjust up my projections of where GDP was going to be. 6 months ago, in June, my projection for where GDP was going to be for 2023 was 1%, 1.0%. And it's going to come in somewhere around 2.5%. Right? That's a big change. That's a big difference. And so what we've seen is inflation's come down faster. Economic growth has remained sustained in a pretty significant way. Those are the ingredients that would get you to what you call the soft landing. I never used those words.
And define a soft landing. What does a soft landing look like?
So that's why I never use those words, because I don't, and I'm certainly not using that imagery for whatever it is. So historically, what people have experienced, what the economy has experienced, is whenever inflation gets out of control, the effort to get it back into control means that you've got to really constrain economic activity significantly. So you're going to see unemployment go up, you're going to see GDP come down, and the amount that unemployment would go up is often in the 1 to 2 to 2.5 percentage points of increase of unemployment, right? And so a year ago, unemployment was, I think, at like 3.4%. Today, it's at 3.7 or 3.8%. All right, that is far less than what you would historically expect to see, while inflation has come down fast. So is that combination where you're seeing inflation is going to land down on the 2% level, or somewhere close to there, and yet you're not going to see a lot of collateral damage to the economy that is close to where you would have expected to see it historically. Now, does that mean that there's no movement? I don't know. So when I started this job, the unemployment rate that folks thought was sustainable for inflationary pressures to not exist was somewhere in like the 4.2, 4.3% unemployment. We're at 3.7, so that is much lower than what the experts and the historians of economics thought was possible. So we are in a very strong position right now. The labor market is quite tight. When I talk to businesses, one of the things they still tell me that they are worried that if they have a vacancy, will I be able to find someone of quality in a short amount of time to backfill that so I can keep doing the things I need to do. And I'd be curious if people are not hearing that, or if you're not feeling that, that would be good to know. But to the extent that's happening, I think we're in a place where we can let our restrictive policy stance work. The slowdown will continue. My projection is it'll be fairly orderly and not as rapid as we've seen in the last 6 to 8 months, but hopefully it will continue in that direction.
Now, there is inflation, disinflation, and deflation. And I think it might be instructive just to define what we're experiencing now. Disinflation.
So this is disinflation. So, and this is actually an interesting thing because, okay, so let me answer his question before I answer the question I started answering. So those are three concepts. Inflation means that the change in price over time is positive, it's going up. Deflation means that the price change over time is going down. Disinflation means that the amount that inflation is going up is less now than it was the month before or the year before. So the pace of change is slowing, right? And what we see now is disinflation. We were at 7%, now we're at 3%, right? Still, inflation is happening. There's positive price changes. It's just less than where it was before. And that is desirable. So disinflation, if you get in a disinflationary environment, that means that there are real questions about the strength of the economy, the quality and the value add of the goods that you're producing, and it suggests that your economy is not in a robust place where you're going to start to see investments and growth and all those sorts of things that we all want to have, right? You want to have some amount of positive pressure on prices because that means we are still producing value-added stuff. We're being productive. We are increasing really our standard of living. So we need that. And so today we have disinflation. And now I can go to the question I was going to ask, or are you going to follow up on that?
I want to follow up. The public sometimes conflates inflation with high prices. We can have disinflation, the slowing of the pace of inflation, without some prices necessarily coming down. They rose and now they're stuck, perhaps. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you know, one of the things that's been interesting, and as I've talked to a number of folks, the question I have is, the question people give me is, well, prices are still high, right? You said that your inflation was coming down, then that should mean the price level should come down. And that's actually not what it means. Disinflation doesn't mean the price level comes down. It means it's just not going to go a lot higher than where we were, than when we are right now. And so I think for a lot of families, there's been an expectation that price pressures are going to just go away and that they won't face the same relative level of high prices that they've been experiencing. Now, the part that is, I think, somewhat reassuring is that expense is always relative to income, right? And what we've seen over the last 6 months or so is wage growth is actually higher. It's exceeding the rate of inflation. So families are actually catching up. And so relative to what these prices meant to them 6 months ago, they're less burdensome now. They're less painful now. And my team is telling me that we should expect that projection to continue. We have a tool called the Atlanta Fed Wage Tracker. And it's a tool, it's online. You all should be going and seeing this on a regular basis. And it tells how wages are changing for people month to month, year to year. And if you know that number and you know the inflation number, when wages are higher than inflation, that's good. That means real wages are positive. And today, real wages are growing, right? And that means people's purchasing power is increasing, which means that the pain associated with these higher prices is decreasing. And that's the place where you want to go. If you want to think about the psychology of the consumer, when they feel like today things are less burdensome than yesterday, their psychology is going to get better. And that's a dynamic that is starting to play out.
I'd like to bore in a little bit more on inflation, how you're thinking about it, how the committee is thinking about it. It's widely expected in 2024 that there will be some rate cuts. And the cuts will begin when the committee is convinced that you're on a sustainable path to the 2% target. How do you look at inflation? Is it one number? Is it several numbers? And how do you decompose inflation to try to get a sense of whether it is sustainable, the disinflation?
So that's a really good question. And I have to say my answer to this question has evolved. Right, so when I first got here, and you know this, the Fed has one preferred measure of inflation is personal consumption expenditures inflation, a PCE index. And leading into the pandemic, and for a long time, like your last years and my first years, that number was, we were not hitting our target. We were at 1.7, 1.8. We were struggling to get up to that 2%. And there was a narrative that maybe there was a challenge that we were not doing enough to get onto our target. But then we started looking, and it's actually right before the pandemic happened, we were looking at, you can calculate inflation a whole host of other ways. You can use consumer prices, producer prices, you can trim things, all this sort of stuff. And it was turning out that every other measure of inflation was at target. It did not have this gap between where it was realized versus target. And we thought it'd be valuable, in thinking about inflation, to think about the range of possibilities of inflation and then tell people about it. So another tool we have is called the underlying inflation dashboard. We show like 8 or 9 different ways that you can calculate inflation, and then we have red, yellow, green sort of thing to tell, is it okay or is it not okay? Right now everything's red. Inflation is high, it's too high. We still got some work to do. But what has been really interesting is, once you know something is red, then it's the question, well, what are you going to look for to see this likelihood that's going to go to green? And if you've been following a number of the media reports on this, one thing that's been talked about is the distinction between inflation for goods versus inflation for services. So goods are the things that you buy, like furniture and all that kind of stuff. Services are the services. So when you go to a hotel or you fly somewhere or those sorts of things. And before the pandemic, goods inflation was basically 0 or maybe even a little less than that. And that services inflation was the part that would pull inflation up to our 2% level. If you look at where we are now, goods inflation has actually returned basically back to pre-pandemic levels. And then it's the services inflation part that is coming down slowly, but we kind of know that services inflation moves more slowly, right? So you can think about like rent, for example, right? Rent doesn't change on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. That's going to change over 6 months, over 12 months. And so there are reasons why you might expect this inflation to really evolve in a sort of a less dramatic way. And that's one of the reasons why I'm expecting it to, I call it orderly, some people call it slow, but that I'm not expecting huge drops because the part of inflation that needs to get back to normal is a part that historically moves much slower, right? So that's kind of how we're thinking about it, but those are the sorts of things that I'm looking at, or our team is looking at, to try to decompose. And ultimately what we're trying to get to is what I would call a normal economy. And normal means all the stuff that happened through the pandemic is no longer driving things, right? So I'm really comparing a lot of the metrics that we're seeing today to where they had been on average over the 3 years leading into the pandemic. And for many of them, they are back at that level, and that is something that I hope continues.
And what time frame influences you most? And what I mean by that is, if you look at month-over-month inflation readings using your preferred index on a core basis, which excludes energy and food, volatile elements, for the last 6 months, it's actually been tracking below 2%. So what are you looking at? Are you looking at month-over-month, 6 month, or full year?
So I'm looking at all of them. But I do think today, the shorter measures are more important. Your 3-month, your 6-month, because when you think about what the 12-month is going to be, those 6 months go into that 12-month. So if the 6-month is low, that puts constraints on how high the 12-month can be. So every month that you're at 2 or below 2, that's one more month that you're likely to get the 12-month to 2. And we're replacing the new numbers with higher numbers. So a year ago, all these numbers were higher. So the adjustment is happening in that way. So I'm definitely looking at these shorter run measures. And as you noted, they are pointing in a very positive direction for us to get to 2%. Now we just need to let time pass, and hopefully that will continue.
But you're still saying we're not there yet. We're not, in your mind, at target yet. So what will convince you, and this is the question that leads into rate cuts in 2024, what will convince you that you are on a path to 2% and it's time to begin to ease policy?
So I'll answer this 2 ways. So one, we are on a path to 2% today. Right, we were at 5 or 6, 7, whatever measure you want to do. We're at 3. Like, that's the path, right? The goal is to make sure we stay on the path. And to make sure you stay on the path, it's all the other things that drive those prices. So if you want, or would it like inflation to come down, the things that would put upward pressure on prices need to not pop, right? So if you think about employment, right? So if employment is coming in super hot, right? And replacement is what, 150 150, 160,000, something like that. If it comes in above that a lot, then that suggests there's going to be upward pressure. You're going to have to compete more for your workers. You're going to have to like pay more, and all those input costs become a significant issue, right? And so I'm starting to look at all these other things. So GDP is another one, right? If we're producing at very high levels and there's that churn, then the demand for inputs is going to be good, and raw materials, all those sorts of things. The cost of transport is going to potentially be higher. And so those are the sorts of things that we start to look at to try to make assessments. And today, honestly, things are looking fairly straightforward, but the pandemic has thrown curveballs repeatedly, right? And so I'm not comfortable even contemplating declaring victory. So we think about declaring victory. We're not thinking about, right? There's still a lot that could happen, and so we just want to remain diligent and really short-run attentive.
I want to ask you about the outlook for policy, but before, you have another side of your mandate, the employment side, and we had an employment report on Friday. How would you characterize, you've already talked about it a little bit, but can you break it down a little bit about, what seems to be driving the job gains and keeping the unemployment rate low?
So that, the employment side has actually been very interesting because your top line numbers have been pretty strong continuously over the last several quarters. If you look underneath the hood a little bit, though, you see something that is a bit different, and it can go either way, right? And so, some of my team who are the experts on this, I just put on a nice face in front of smart people. They have pointed out that if you look at how employment is growing, there are really two sectors where most of the jobs are coming in: healthcare and governmental services, right? And for month to month, those are covering like 60 to 70% of all the job growth.
And you could argue that both of those are somewhat independent of demand in the broad economy.
You definitely could argue that, but in healthcare for sure, we've got an aging population, all those sorts of things. So that's 60 to 70% of job growth, approximately, and it's about 20% of the economy. Right, so so you've got a relatively small part of the economy that's driving a lot of the energy and the growth, which means that the slowdown is actually happening, right? So that one could take from that, our policies are working, and so now the question is, does that continue in a way such that we stay in the smooth path, or do we get to a place where it slows down so much that you're nearing a cliff, and you could see that it's going to slow down in an accelerated way, right? That is something that we are watching, and so one of the things that I often do now when I go out and I talk to folks, I ask the question, like, how many people in this room are expecting or planning on laying anybody off in the next 3 months or in the next 6 months? At the height of the pandemic, and no hands went up, like nobody was thinking about that. All right, so like a year ago, the bankers were thinking about that because mortgages have slowed down. Mortgage rates went up fast, so their hands went up, but nobody else's hands went up. So if I were going to do that today, show of hands, how many folks are planning on laying anybody off in the next 6 months? And these are Vegas rules, so you can't. Nobody can report out. Oh, I saw Mary put her hand up.
This guy's a banker, so I know it's in the bankings.
All right. So the point here, though, is that a vast majority of this room is not thinking about that, right? And to me, that is somewhat reassuring that we're not at the cusp of something that is going to lead to a significant contraction. All right. Now, I ask this question a lot now. Like this is one of the things I really want to make sure I have my finger on the pulse of. Like, to what extent are we about to see significant job losses? Because that'll be a sign that the dynamic is starting to shift, and we're going to have to think then about the implications of our policy moving forward. But, one of the reasons my team has me out talking a lot through these cycles is because we need to be getting those touch points on a regular basis so we can see the change as it's happening and not find out like 2 months later that all this stuff was going to come.
Before we get to the policy path, I want one more question on the dynamic of disinflation. One reads that the supply chain is coming into balance, and the supply chain, arguably the transitory argument that I think you actually started to call it the T word, right?
Yeah, I don't say that word.
When it was in disrepute, but the transitory argument was just slow, but it's coming back into balance. So is it policy that's causing the disinflation, or the supply chain, or what?
Yes. So it's all of it. So, okay, so inflation happens because the demand for goods is greater than the supply, right? So when the demand is too high, there's an auction for prices. The people who want it more are willing to pay more, and so that winds up being the price, right? So it's about this gap, and the question is, to get back to normal, you gotta close the gap. There are only 3 ways that can happen. Demand comes all the way down, supply goes all the way up, or they kind of meet in the middle, right? And what we've seen, and yeah, as you noted, supply has come back. You all remember at the beginning of the pandemic, the supply chain disruption and all this kind of stuff. Nobody's talking about that anymore, right? And so that has eased. With the ability to get your inputs to your factories and your goods to the marketplace has gotten a lot better. Another part that we didn't anticipate, I'll say I didn't anticipate, labor force has come back in supply, the greater than expected. You've heard people talk about the labor force participation rate. It is stronger now than I expected it to be. So you're actually getting more workers out there to help produce. So that supply is actually responding in a positive way. But as I noted with the employment, demand is coming down as well, right? So we're getting to a meet in the middle sort of situation. And that meet in the middle, to the extent that that plays out, means that there's less that we have to do, right? So as the effective gap winds up being smaller, so that the bite that our policy needs to have can be less. And that's kind of the dynamic that we are seeing today, and the question is whether that will persist.
Well, you're describing a pretty favorable picture, and therefore the committee, I believe, individuals on the committee in December projected a certain number of rate cuts in 2024. The median was 3. But the range for the lion's share of the committee was 2 to 4. You want to tell us what your dot was?
I'm 2.
You're 2, okay. So you're a little bit more cautious, a little more conservative. Talk to us a bit about, what's the likelihood of rate cuts, when rate cuts might be on the table. What's your thinking on that, to the extent that you can talk about it?
Oh, no, I can talk about it.
Yeah.
So I want to say one thing, and this should not be the headline. I was going to preface this.
Howard, did you hear that?
And Karen is shaking her head now, my public affairs person. She's nervous now. Every meeting is live for every act, right? So I never go into a meeting with a preconceived notion that we can only do X, or we can only do Y, or we can only do Z. It depends on what happens. Right, so I want to start with that. In today's environment, I think the risks are balanced. Employment is slowing a lot. There's still upward pressure that's out there. You see the GDP numbers are still stronger than people expect. Right, so in that balanced environment, in a situation where inflation is still higher than our target, I've got a natural bias to being tighter than more accommodating in policy. And so today, we are tighter, and we are in a restrictive stance, and that I'm comfortable with that. And I just want to see the economy continue to evolve with us in that stance, and hopefully see inflation continue to get to our 2% level. And then if it makes more progress, then I'll be more comfortable thinking about cuts. Now, My projection for the end of this year for inflation that we did in the dot plots is about 2.5%. Right, 2.5 is still not 2. Right, so we will not, in my mind, want to be removing all of our restrictiveness. There's still going to be some slowdown that's required in terms of inflation, but 2.5 isn't 4 either. And if you want to land at 2, you can't wait till you're at 2 to start to pull some of the restrictiveness off, right? And so part of where we're going now, or what we're looking for, is that progression of inflation to continue us on that path, so that we can get to a place where we can start to remove some of the restrictiveness. I want to say one other thing, which is ton of uncertainty exists today, right? And that uncertainty is one of the reasons why I don't want us to move too fast with certainty today when we're still a ways away, right? So we've got geopolitics, we've got climate issues and the disruptions from storms and all the losses. We've got a lot of things that we have been living with for a while. And it's unclear if those things evolve in ways they could drive the economy in a lot of different directions. So I want to make sure that we are really, really there before we do too much as if we are really, really there, because a mistake is a problem there. And I'll just say, we have history on this. So in the 70s, the Fed started removing accommodation too soon, inflation spiked back up, then we had to tighten, inflation came down, then we removed it again, it went back up, and by the time we were done with that, all Americans could think about was inflation, right? And that's exactly what you don't want. So when we are on this pathway down, we got to get there, right? That is non-negotiable in this context. And then once that happens, then we can sort of think about some of the other things.
So let me then throw the hated two-part question at you. The first part is, if you're a kind of a high for longer guy, and disinflation continues, so the rate of inflation continues to decline, keeping the policy rate relatively high, then you are tightening in real rate terms, that is inflation-adjusted terms. And the risk could be, it's argued, that you'll precipitate a recession by keeping that stance. So the question is, what do you think about that real rate problem? And how, is there a scenario in which we could go into recession?
Well, I didn't like the last part of that. So that was the third part of a two-part question, right? So I'm gonna just
answer whatever question.
Yeah, I might look to another way to go on this. So to your first point, yes, you're exactly right. That if our policy stance is at point X and inflation continues to fall, that gap, that's sort of a measure of tightness. That gap continues to grow. I've been calling it passive tightening. That's a thing, and that's a real thing. I will tell you, I mentioned at the very beginning that inflation is 0.5 percentage point lower now than I thought it was going to be 6 months ago. And as a result, I've actually adjusted what I think the appropriate pathway for policy should be. So I had us only doing one increase this year, and it was way at the end of the year. Now I got 2, and I'm looking at third quarter. So that experience has caused me to say, we can't be passively tightening for so long, given what we've seen in terms of the trajectory of inflation. And so moving forward, and this is where I think the risks are two-sided, you could have an environment where inflation stalls out, right? And the economy is super strong, and your price pressures just stay where they are, which means that I got to then go back and push cuts further into the future because things haven't moved. There's another scenario, inflation continues faster than I expect, which then would mean I got to pull forward even some more. Today, my outlook is not for that acceleration. And as I said, if we think about sort of services inflation, it usually evolves in a slower way. So that's what my outlook is. But this is where we got to pay attention, because inflation surprised to the downside over the last 6 months. It could do that again, and if it does that, then we're going to have to adjust. There's one other scenario which people are also talking about, which is on the employment side. You know, we've been talking inflation because it was so far away, but if employment also decided to contract significantly, that would be another thing we'd have to take on board and have the relative weighting of the employment mandate versus the price stability mandate in terms of our policy, and that's a hard thing.
John's gonna tell us it's time for member questions. Is that right, John?
It's time for member questions. And if we could come to both of these mics, please, and ask your question, that would be great. And I see one over here. So Eloisa, let's start with you.
So I was hoping you could help shed some light for me. So the 10-year Treasury bond helps to monitor or kind of leads mortgage rates. Why are mortgage rates kind of coming down if the Fed hasn't done anything on the interest rate? So Fed rate, I should say. Thank you.
So that's a good question. I want to ask them the same thing. So here's what I think about with mortgage rates. What we've seen is, and this has actually been quite interesting, financial markets, they take signals from the Fed, like where the baseline interest rate, and then they make judgments about where their rate needs to be. Every rate in the economy is basically a margin on top of what we have as our Fed funds rate. And when we, at the very beginning, we were at 0, and we started saying we're going to increase our rates. The first, I think we moved 25 basis points. Mortgage rates increased like 300 basis points. They went up to 6 or 7 in anticipation of where we were ultimately going to be. There's a story you might tell here. This is the same thing, right? We've now signaled that, you know, we think we're at a sufficiently restrictive stance, and so the relative likelihood of going up versus going down has shifted. And so mortgage rates are anticipating, the mortgage market's anticipating that things will come down. I think that's what's going on, but you know, interest rate dynamics in markets can be super complicated. So I don't want to put my hat 100% on that, but I think there's a lot of that expectation that's going on. And as you will see in the markets, if you watch CNBC, they'll all tell you the markets think we're going to be cutting like in 2 meetings. Some think we're going to cut at the next meeting. If that's your expectation, then you would expect mortgage rates to be coming down pretty significantly because everything's going to change very shortly.
Great. So we just entered the lightning round. Quick questions, quick answers. So, RK.
2 comments, one about Raphael, other one about Dennis. Dennis, you did a great job giving his bio. One thing you missed, that Raphael is an excellent Indian cook, that he has seen that at my house. So there's one thing I want to add. Another thing is, one more thing, that when you are not the president of Federal Reserve, your, sense of humor goes up. So my question is that when you talk about all these numbers, they are national numbers. Can you tell us about your region? How do they reflect these numbers compared to the national numbers?
Sure. So thank you, RK, for the question. The U.S. economy and the 6th district economy, I'm the 6th district, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee, parts of those 3, they're almost our mirror images. So the strength that we see in the U.S. economy, we are definitely seeing throughout the Southeast. Atlanta as a metro area is super powerful. And so the growth that we are seeing here, I think is a precursor, or sort of points to the U.S. economy being strong as well.
Great.
Raphael, while a lot of economic indicators have improved, we still have an inverted yield curve, which has been a pretty good predictor of recessions in the past. Does the inverted yield curve bother you, and when do you see it normalizing?
So it's something that we look at. It doesn't bother me that much. And part of it is we've just gone through a very unusual economic circumstance. The pandemic circumstance is just unlike anything that we've seen before. And I think that then means that all of the standard metrics and things that we might look at, they're just not going to mean the same things. And so as we normalize, I would expect to see these sort of measures start to get back into their normal position. And if that doesn't happen, then that'll be something I definitely have to look at.
Okay.
Raphael, there's a tremendous human-oriented story about immigration in our country, or our country's difficulty dealing with immigration right now. What's the economic case for encouraging or discouraging for us getting our act together or not getting our act together with all the people knocking at the door to get into our country?
Well, I think the economic case for immigration is that it's an input to labor supply, right? And so that can be like almost like a pressure valve. If you feel that labor markets are getting super tight, immigration can sort of ease some of that. To the extent that it's not there, then that means that there's going to be pressure on labor markets. It'll be upward pressure on wages and probably reduce our economic potential. So that's kind of the thing that you have to think about.
Milton?
Raphael, let me ask you to fly the plane a little lower. About 40% of the labor market in Georgia doesn't earn enough to pay their monthly expenses. They're working hard. These are the essential workers that we all praised. What should we, the dreaded two-part question, what's the Fed think about, do about those kinds of issues? Is it a concern of the Feds? And secondly, what should leaders in this room be doing? We rely on these, we hire them, but we also hire them for services and other things that make our lives comfortable. What should we be doing?
So to your first question, it is something we are concerned about. You know, our bank, our tagline is an economy that works for everyone. And the closer we get to that, the stronger our economy will be. It'll be more resilient, it'll be more innovative, and people will be more prosperous, and that's a good thing. So we have a host of things that we are doing that are not directly monetary policy based to try to facilitate that, to make sure that everyone has access to opportunity, that institutions are working for folks, and that the networks that are around are allowing folks that are perhaps struggling to find out about jobs and opportunities and connections that can put them in a better place. And we could do a whole nother program on that easily. The other thing I would say is that, and I know it's supposed to be a short one, but getting inflation to 2% is an essential part of this. When we had inflation that was under control from 2012 to 2019, we had continuous growth. We saw unemployment rates in groups that had very high unemployment, African Americans, for example, fall to historically low levels, right? And it was because there was stability in the economy, and that stability meant that businesses and families were willing to invest in themselves, to position themselves to be maximally productive and get to a better place, right? So we do have that role as well. But a lot of the other institutional problems, we don't have the solution for, but we definitely want to talk about them so that the policymakers that can make a difference are aware of the problem and actually know what some of the approaches to solve them have been.
So we got our last three questions here. I want to also make sure you see leadership lessons. So take a picture of this so you get an idea of Raphael's leadership lessons at the Atlanta Fed. Keith?
Georgia, for the last almost decade, badge of honor for all of us, best place in which to do business. Poverty in our region, if you're born poor here in Metro Atlanta, worst place in the country statistically in terms of getting out. So similar to Milton's question, what can we do? First, how do those two things coexist? And then secondly, what can we be doing as employers to make it such that people who are born in some respects at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder so that they can have an opportunity to enjoy what the rest of us are enjoying?
Yes, so a couple things. One, this exists because networks are not universal, right? That there are people who are on the inside and there are people on the outside, and the people on the outside have no way to get to the inside. They don't know anybody, they have not ever heard about things, and so one thing to think about is what can we do to broaden the network, open it up, remove the mystery, give access to opportunity. So I've been talking just recently, we adopted, actually I shouldn't say it like that, we have a program where we reach out to students in underprivileged communities, high schools, that have not typically graduated folks, and we bring them in for 2 weeks. And we call it a career experience. We introduce them to all the jobs that we have. We help them write resumes. We're trying to get them to reimagine what their network could be and what it should be. Like these are low-cost things. These aren't things that require millions of dollars. But talking to people, being transparent. Think about, like, what's a neighborhood we haven't ever had an employee from? Do you know anything about that neighborhood? Have you been to that neighborhood? Have you talked to anyone from those places? And try to just run your own networks in that way. And that could also start to bear significant fruit. You know, I was talking about another thing, but it struck me when I first went to Harvard. You know, I was first from my high school ever to go to Harvard, and there were things I didn't know, right? And it was only because I was there and actually was next to someone and they were going somewhere. It's like, where are you going? And they said, oh, you have to do this, and it was like, oh, so I tagged along. It's those sorts of things and those sorts of experiences that can make a world of difference, and it's often little acts that make that difference. And can change what people think the possibilities are.
2 final questions, and make a note also of our upcoming meetings.
There seems to be a growing concern in some areas about a gradual transition started by presumably the White House, major financial institutions, and probably the Fed, toward a digital dollar. Do you have any comments on that?
Sure. A lot would have to happen for us to do a central bank currency, if you will. I do think in a lot of ways we already have one, right? So if you think about all the ways money gets transferred back and forth, that's all digital now. I don't do that. I'm a Luddite. That's a whole another show. But I do think a lot of the benefits of technology in payments is being realized. And you know, another thing that we are doing to facilitate that is we have a new payment rail called FedNow, which is for instant payment and instant settlements, which actually should reduce overdraft fees and a whole host of things, help businesses get their money faster, small businesses in particular. These are the ways that you can leverage technology to get to that instantaneous aspect. The central bank digital currency will require some policy changes by the Congress before I think we would even really contemplate it, and we'll see where those conversations go.
And final question, I know, Bob, I've heard your question before, so I know it's a softball one, so go ahead and offer it up.
It's a softball. Well, this whole meeting began with Dennis talking about I think it was a multi-billion-dollar Zimbabwean note. I do have a $1 trillion Zim note that I think was the highest denomination they ever did. But Raphael, our federal government, both parties, and the White House continue to pass budgets that have massive amounts, $1 trillion of, and this year I think is projected to be $2 trillion, of deficit spending. Our national debt is sitting at $34 trillion. And what is the long-term impact, and how long can that be sustained?
So I don't know how long it can be sustained, but I think there's a consensus that is not long run sustainable. And you know, one of the things that is true is that the higher interest rates actually put more pressure on this, and it will make this more salient as a decision-making factor because the cost to service the debt goes up. And so the pressure has risen, I think, pretty significantly. And you know, we'll see where policymakers go on this. You know, I talk to folks, a lot of folks all over the place. This is something that I didn't hear much about this at the height of the pandemic. I'm hearing more about this and more concerns across the board. And my guess is that policymakers are starting to feel a little more heat on it, and we'll just have to see where they go. But it is something that is pressure that is rising on our budget and how we do our fiscal policy. It's going to be, I think it's going to be an interesting year to see policymakers and the leadership wrestle with this important topic.
Raphael, thank you very much for an outstanding comment. And Dennis, great questions. Going along with the soft landing, we have some great socks for both of you, soft standing. So it's